excited to present this work on national trends in district PL spending. I'm the person presenting today, but this project has really been a group effort at Annenberg and would not have been possible without the help from John, Nate, and Brendan. The story of this project starts with this slide that we sometimes use when we're describing what Ripple does. We know that Teacher PL can improve teacher practice and student outcomes, but we also know that many programs do not have any impact at all, and it's not yet clear why that's the case. This means that at least some portion of the $18 billion spent annually on Teacher PL has limited return on investment and is not currently advancing educational equity. By working to understand the specific features that make Teacher PL effective, Ripple aims to provide actionable guidance to the field that can increase the return on investment. But the motivation for this project comes from the fact that our understanding of the investment side of this equation is also pretty limited. So this $18 billion number comes from a 2015 report conducted by the Boston Consulting Group and commissioned by the Gates Foundation. So that number is firstly now a decade old, and the report also doesn't provide any details about how the figure was estimated. When we go to the broader literature on PL spending, we find that most studies focus on case studies of a few individual districts rather than national trends in PL spending. And this is for a few reasons that make a lot of sense. First, districts are key decision makers when it comes to PL spending. They provide PL directly and allocate funds for PL that's selected by schools or that individual teachers opt into. Districts keep financial records and records related to the PL services with a level of detail that's not typically present when we look at state or national data systems. And districts are also a manageable unit of analysis for researchers to actually go through all these records and try to make sense of what should count as PL spending and what shouldn't, and can talk to district personnel to really understand the details of these records, which is also not feasible at a state or national level. But what that approach leaves us with is a huge range of estimates for district spending on PL that are really hard to interpret. So here I'm showing you a few estimates of district spending from the last 2 decades, with the most recent estimates at the top. In the left column, I'm showing you estimates of per teacher spending, and in the right column, estimates of PL spending as a percentage of total district expenditures. And these are the 2 most commonly used metrics for PL spending because they allow for a more apples to apples comparison across districts of different sizes. Because we would, of course, expect larger districts that are serving more teachers to spend more overall on professional learning. What you can see from these 2 columns is that even within the same study, there's considerable variation in spending. For example, the ERS study from 2013 estimated that district spending varied anywhere from $8,000 per teacher to $22,000 per teacher. And then when we look across all of the studies, the variation is enormous. Districts are spending anywhere from $1,400 per teacher to $22,000 per teacher, or between 2 and almost 20% of their budget on PL. Now, in theory, we could use any of these estimates that I'm showing you to calculate total PL spending nationally if we were to just multiply by the number of teachers or estimate the percentage of total expenditures. But in practice, it's really difficult to interpret the variation in estimates or to know which estimate we would even pick to make that calculation. First, districts studied may not be representative of the country as a whole. And in fact, most of the districts that have been studied in these prior studies are large urban districts, but we know that the majority of the districts in the country are actually small and more rural. And this is a really important issue when we think about national trends in professional learning, because we know that there's wide variation in district spending, even for these large districts and within the same study. And so we can't just take any of those numbers and calculate an estimate. Second, different studies use different definitions of PL activities and costs, which makes it difficult to compare across studies or know why one study might have a higher number than another, and also raises questions about what the right definition should be. And finally, these studies are scattered across the last 2 decades, but we don't have any insight into the role of changes over time in the variation that we see. So if we really want to better understand large-scale trends in PL spending, we need representative or national data that would give us a more complete picture of the country as a whole, a consistent definition of PL activities and spending, and multiple years of data that would allow us to actually investigate change over time. And that's what we are trying to provide in this study. So we are using national district finance data collected by the National Center for Education Statistics, or NCES. We're specifically using data from the F33, which is a survey of K through 12 district revenues and expenditures that's part of the NCES Common Core of data. One thing that's notable about this data set is that districts are given detailed guidelines for what counts as PL spending when they're completing this survey. And NCES also does some additional work on the back end once the data are collected to try to ensure that reporting is consistent across districts and states so that we can make comparisons. We have this F33 data from all public school districts across all 50 states and DC for the years 1999 to 2021. And we're also going to pull in data from two other sources that are part of the Common Core of data. The first is the district data, which includes non-fiscal data like the number of teachers, which we use to calculate per teacher estimates of spending. And then also the comparable wage index for teachers, which is also known as the SWIFT, that allows us to adjust spending for differences in the cost of living to make comparisons across more urban and less urban areas. Given what I told you about different studies using different definitions of PL spending, you might be wondering what the F33 is actually going to count to interpret what I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time up front talking to you about the details of what is counted as PL spending in the F33. So the F33 includes these activities listed here. The first is formal PED activities. These are things like coaching and workshops, what we would sort of traditionally think about that comes to mind when we say professional learning or professional development. It also includes time that teachers spend together planning for curriculum implementation and differentiation for student needs. It includes district-wide student assessments. So this is not state testing or assessments that are implemented by an individual teacher, but district-wide assessment. It includes library and media services, which is primarily the cost, like the salaries of librarians and the cost of library operations. And finally, it includes instruction-related technology. Importantly, this is non-classroom technology. So this is not computers that have been brought into the classroom and given to students. This is more like school computer labs. It also captures a pretty comprehensive range of costs that are associated with these activities. That includes purchased PL services, like consultant and vendor fees, conference fees and tuition for teachers that individually attend PD that's offered by external organizations, salaries and stipends for district employed PL leaders, any training and support and professional development for those leaders, the cost of paying substitutes so that teachers can attend PD if it occurs during normal class time, and finally, materials or facilities that need to be purchased or rented specifically for the PL. So for example, renting out a hotel ballroom to accommodate all the teachers in the district for a district-wide PD. There are also a few notable exclusions that are not counted in the F33 data. First, we're not capturing the cost of administrator time because administrator salaries are counted in a separate question in the survey. And similarly, we're not capturing teacher time that is spent on PL. And we are also excluding a few types of costs that have been included in previous studies that have more expansive different definitions of PL spending, namely the additional cost associated with paying teachers more if they attend PL or have better performance evaluations, and the cost of evaluating teachers overall. So while some of the details about how NCES defines PL spending align with the prior literature and what we would choose to count, others don't. So here I've highlighted in orange the areas that we would not choose, that are not aligned with the choices that we would make. So if we had control over how to define PL spending in the F33, we would prefer not to include student assessment, library and media and services, or instruction-related technology. And we would prefer to include administrator time cost and teacher time cost, since that time could be used for other things that might benefit student learning. Teacher salary lanes and bonuses have been included in the prior literature, as I mentioned, but only in these studies with more expansive definitions, and we feel these are less central to capturing districts' direct investment in PL. Unfortunately, we can't disaggregate our data here across these different types of costs. We can only see the total spending across all these areas, and the proportion of that spending that goes to salaries, stipends, and benefits for district employees that are facilitating PL. But what we're sacrificing here in detail, we are gaining in scale to be able to look at spending across the whole country. So given these challenges with the F33 data, we wanted to see how the estimates from the data would compare with estimates from the prior literature. So for studies where we were able to identify a specific district sample and the year that it was estimated, we actually were able to pull that data from the F33 to compare with what the original authors found. So as an example, the TNTP Mirage study was of 3 large districts, and they estimated that those districts spent on average $18,000 per teacher. That study does not provide specific district names, but based on the sort of general characteristics they provide about those districts, we were able to identify in our data about 20 districts that we thought would be similar, and found that those districts spend about $9,000 per teacher on average, so about half of what TNTP estimated. For the other studies listed here, we were actually able to pull individual districts like DC and Duval, and we're showing one example for each, but there were several other districts that we were able to do this for. And across the board, we find that our estimates are lower than what is provided by the original authors. And this makes sense to us for 2 reasons. One is that the teacher and administrator time that we're not including in our estimates is likely particularly expensive for ongoing PL like coaching and professional learning communities, which we either know from these prior studies or expect based on the context that districts would be using. And these particular studies, these 3 here, are also using these more expansive definitions of PL that include teacher evaluation and salary bumps. So this means that we're thinking of our data as providing a reasonable lower bound for PL spending. Hopefully, I've convinced you at this point that we need to know more about trends in PL spending at a national level, and that the F33 can help us do that. So let's get to what the data actually tell us. Our first key takeaway is that we are spending far more on PL at a national level than the previous estimates I showed you suggest. So compared with the $18 billion that I showed you at the beginning, we estimate that as of 2021, districts were spending $37 billion toward PL, with about 70% of that going towards salaries and benefits for staff employed by the district to provide the PL services. The remaining 30% would be for materials, external vendors, tuition reimbursements, rental of facilities, and things like that. Individual districts are spending an average of $7,700 per teacher, which is lower than the $18,000 estimated by TNTP, but generally on par with the lower end of the estimates that I showed you at the beginning. And again, makes sense because those studies were focused primarily on large urban districts, but our average here is also including the many, many, many smaller and more rural districts across the country. When we do look only at the 100 largest districts in the country that are more similar to the districts that have been studied in the past, we find that they spend an average of $12,000 per teacher, so closer to the higher end of the estimates that we saw at the beginning. Our second key takeaway is that while some spending patterns have shifted substantially between 1999 and 2021, others have really not changed much at all. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen substantial increases in PL spending. Total spending has nearly doubled, and per teacher spending has increased by about 40%. But over the same time period, we've seen very little change in the proportion of districts' overall budget dedicated to PL, and the proportion of PL spending dedicated to salaries and benefits for district staff. And this is what I'll dig into a little bit more on the next few slides. So here we're plotting total PL spending across all districts for each year in our sample between 1999 and 2021. So the x-axis is year and the y-axis is dollars, which we've adjusted for inflation. So all of the amounts are reported in 2021 dollars. Because we do have to contend with some missing data, we don't have PL spending data for every single district in every single year. We estimate the numbers that you see here using a regression with district fixed effects that allow us to look at how individual district spending has changed over time. And then we can aggregate that up across the whole country with the average, and then we use the averages in any given year to fill in for districts that have missing data in that particular year. So in 1999, we're estimating that districts spent $19 billion on professional learning, which is notably very similar to the $18 billion from the 2015 report that I showed you at the beginning, but is estimated here for 1999. As we move across years, we see a steady increase in PL spending until we hit the recession in 2008, where PL spending dips. Then we see some recovery and continued increase until 2020, where we see a drop likely connected to the beginning of the pandemic. And finally, a bump in 2021 with the infusion of ESSER funds. Here we're looking at the same graph that I just showed you, but this time using average per teacher spending, again adjusted for inflation. So in general, we're seeing similar trends over time from the previous slide, but everything is just less dramatic because all of these increases and decreases for recessions are divided across all the teachers within a district. And all told, per teacher spending increased by about 40% from 1999 to 2021. So from $5,500 to $7,700. Given these large increases, we might have also expected to see an increase in the percentage of districts' overall budget dedicated to PL. But what we're actually seeing here is that the percentage of spending has hovered around 3% across this full time period. So in 1999, we started at 2.9% on the left, and in 2021, we ended at 3.3%. Because our sample is so large, this is a statistically significant increase, but it's practically very small and is also importantly not enough to explain the increases in overall spending and per teacher spending that I showed you on the previous slides. And the reason that we're not seeing much change here is that the overall spending on districts' budgets overall has increased at basically the same rate as PL spending. And so we don't see a change in the percentage dedicated to PL. The other thing that hasn't changed much over time is the proportion of PL spending dedicated to salaries and benefits for the district staff that facilitate PL activities. In 1999, districts were spending 69% of their PL budget on salaries and benefits, and that is essentially flat. In 2021, they were spending 68%. The remaining 30% is for things like purchase of materials, facilities rental, purchase of services from external organizations. And this was initially surprising to us, given the trend over the last 2 decades towards more ongoing PL, like coaching and professional learning communities, where you need people available for an extended duration to facilitate. And you could imagine that as districts shift towards this more ongoing PL, it might become more worthwhile to invest in your own personnel to provide those services and service coaches and facilitators, which would potentially increase the percentage of the budget spent on personnel. But unfortunately, we aren't able to see what kinds of PL structures districts are investing in. And so we can't tell if, for example, districts are actually purchasing now from vendors more ongoing services, or are providing more coaching themselves internally, but now relying more heavily on external vendors to provide one-off workshops, sort of keeping the percentage the same, even though they've changed the structures. Finally, our third key takeaway focuses on how spending varies across districts rather than the over time variation that I showed you on the previous section. So we find that per teacher spending varies considerably across districts, and this holds true even when we adjust for differences between states and differences in the cost of living. We have more work that we want to do to understand how and why districts vary, but 2 patterns stand out to us so far that I'll talk about today. The first is that larger and more urban districts tend to spend far more on PL than smaller and less urban districts. And smaller districts also spend a smaller percentage of their PL budget on salaries, stipends, and benefits for district employees. So here I'm showing you a map of all the school districts in the US, color-coded based on their per teacher spending in 2021, according to the scale on the right. So the districts in the lightest yellow spend less than $5,000 per teacher in 2021, and districts in the darkest purple spend $25,000 per teacher or more. When we look across the map, we can see that there are clear differences across states. For example, the East Coast is generally greener and more purple, and the Mid-South is more yellow. But we also see a lot of variation within states. We can see that Texas, for example, has areas across the full color spectrum from the light yellow to the deep purple. And in fact, when we decompose the variation in spending, we find that 70% of the variation is within states and only 30% of the variation is between states. Since I already showed you that 70% of district spending is on salaries and benefits, you might think that most of the variation in this map just relates to differences in cost of living and wages between urban and rural areas within states. So that in Texas, for example, districts are spending more per teacher because they're having to pay higher wages to the coaches that provide PL. But in creating this map, we've actually adjusted per teacher spending using the SWIFT for the cost of living differences. And so that is not explaining the variation that we see here. And this, of course, then raises the question of what does explain the variation that we see. And that is my focus for the last part of this presentation, where we'll be looking only at differences within states by controlling for differences between states using state fixed effects. And we are continuing to use this cost of living adjustment. So here I'm plotting the relationship between district size and per teacher spending. On the x-axis are district size categories based on the number of students, going from less than 250 students on the left to 100,000 students or more on the right. On the y-axis is per teacher spending, which has been adjusted for cost of living differences and differences from state to state. As we move across the x-axis, we can see that districts with more students tend to spend more per teacher, while districts with less than 250 students on the far left spend about $6,500 per teacher on average. Districts with 30 to 50,000 students spend nearly double that. And then we also see a dip in per teacher spending for districts with more than 50,000 students. And these typically are districts in large metropolitan areas like Houston and suburbs around DC. While many large districts are urban, there are also a fair number of large rural districts, so we may wonder about the role of urbanicity in PL spending separate from district size. So here I'm showing you the same graph as before, but I've plotted separate lines by district urbanicity. So the blue line is for districts that are cities, and then suburbs, towns, and rural. We immediately see that more urban districts in blue spend more per teacher across all of the size categories, but we also still see within each urbanicity category that larger districts also tend to spend more on PL. So both patterns are present. Finally, we wondered about differences in the percent that districts spend on salaries and benefits as the other way that we can disaggregate our data. Here I'm showing the same graph as before, but instead of per teacher spending, we have the percent of the PL budget dedicated to salaries and benefits on the y-axis. And we're seeing that the smallest districts on the left spend a smaller percentage of their PL budget on salaries and benefits, while districts with less than 250 students dedicate about 55% of their PL budget to salaries and benefits. Districts with 4,000 or more students dedicate about 80% of their budget. As with the previous slides, we're controlling for differences between states to focus on variation within states. And we are also controlling here for district urbanicity to be consistent with the previous slides, but we essentially find no difference in the percent of the budget dedicated to salaries and benefits based on whether a district is more urban or more rural. So to summarize our key findings, we are spending far more on PL at a national level than previous estimates suggest, about $7,700 per teacher and $37 billion in total as of 2021. While PL spending has increased substantially over the last 2 decades, the proportion of the budget allocated to PL and the allocation of PL spending between personnel and non-personnel, so salaries and benefits versus materials and vendors, has hardly changed. Even after controlling for differences between states and differences in cost of living, PL spending varies considerably across districts. And so far, we are able to say that larger and more urban districts spend more per teacher than smaller and rural districts, even when we are controlling for these cost of living differences. To conclude, marshaling the $37 billion spent annually on teacher PL to advance educational equity requires not only understanding the features of effective PL, which is Ripple's core mission, but also understanding districts' fiscal decision-making processes when it comes to PL. In particular, we need to understand how districts allocate money toward PL. There's some recent work on school board budget approvals suggesting that districts may simply be copying the previous year's budget and saying, last year we spent 3%, so next year we'll spend 3% of whatever our total operating budget is. We are planning to leverage Annenberg's relationships with districts in Rhode Island to try to dig deeper into this question, at least in one state. We also need to understand what the money is actually spent on, which unfortunately we are unable to do with this NCES data, whether it's coaching or workshops, and what internal personnel versus external vendors are providing and how this has changed over time. So because this is not available in this NCES data, we're planning to leverage more detailed state budget data to again investigate this, at least in 1 or 2 states. And we're also looking into potentially using some teacher survey data from nationally representative samples to give us some additional insight, but we can't match it one-to-one to the individual districts that are in our data. Finally, of course, we want to understand the return on investment for this spending. Are we actually seeing improvements in student outcomes when districts spend more on PL? And for this, we're planning to use national assessment data to take an initial look at the relationship between PL spending and student learning. Thank you very much, and I'm excited to hear questions and comments.
Great, thanks so much, Arielle. We have a few questions in the Q&A box, so we can read those out loud, and just want to encourage everyone again, if you have any questions that came up for you as Arielle was speaking, go ahead and enter them and we'll address them as they come in. So the first one, Lynette Parker is asking, what role do the teacher unions play in the amount of PL and the funds attached? Are there different trends in districts with weaker, quote unquote, weaker teacher unions?
That's a great question. We don't have union status available in our data, so we can't do that at a national scale, but that's something that we could potentially look at a subset of states, a state subset, and try to answer that. And state, it would be interesting to think about state differences. We haven't done the analysis, but some states are more union friendly than others, and so that would be another way to think about it. But I don't have an answer about that right now.
Right, the next question is asking, I'm curious about the increased spending as population sizes increase. One would think economies of scale would lead to savings. Why the increase?
Yes, this economies of scale question is something that we've been talking about on our team for a while as to why we don't see that. And our our initial hypothesis was that, well, maybe the districts that are larger have more students with more needs, so like higher poverty students, for example, or students that are more English language learners. And unfortunately, the data that we have for that is there's just a lot of missing data, so we can't do a full scale analysis of that relationship. But for the districts that we do have that data, we see a little bit of a relationship. So we do see some additional spending in districts that have more students, and we haven't been able to look at poverty yet. That is one that we're hoping to do. But in districts that have more ELL students and more SPED students.
And then Sarah, hi Sarah, is asking, does the rating of the district's schools also impact the PL spending? For example, if the district is deemed high performing, does the PL spending increase?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, and something that we hadn't thought about, but I think we could do as we connect it to student outcome data. If we take the previous year, the assessment from the previous year as a sort of proxy for the rating, that would be really interesting to say. So I appreciate all these questions are giving us lots of ideas for next steps.
Yeah, definitely. And we're recording too, so they're captured for you, Arielle. And Anthony Armstrong is asking, when will you be looking at assessment data for the ROI question?
So I think I can answer this one of two ways. One is whether you mean like when our team will have time to do this, and that is next on our list. And I'm sure that Ripple will send out information when that's available. Or perhaps asking about like what timing of the assessment data, and I would have to go back in and look at the availability that matches up with the years that we have. But certainly more recent years would be interesting. COVID obviously has had a lot of impact on assessment data, so we'd probably have to look at sort of more recent years, but prior to COVID.
Alrighty. Jinasha, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Given that 70% of PL budget is spent on salaries and benefits, and salaries tend to be higher in urban areas, would this explain the difference in PL spending between urban versus suburban versus rural?
Right, that's a great question. So when we first looked at the relationships, that was our immediate response. And that is why we went out and found this SWIFT data that actually gives us an estimate of how cost of living and salaries differ across different districts. So all the results that I showed you about the relationship between spending and urbanicity we've already controlled for differences in cost of living, and we're still seeing this relationship. So it doesn't explain actually much of that pattern.
Thanks for all these questions. Suzanne is asking, or it says, I'm curious to hear more about your plan for correlating PL spending and student achievement. How will you control for the many factors that affect achievement, and how will you account for the possibility that higher needs students / lower achievement drives PL spending rather than the reverse?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And one of the reasons that we haven't sort of done this as the core part of our analysis to begin with is that we don't have a good way of getting at a robust causal estimate that tells us about how PL spending really drives student outcomes. So we would really just be doing a descriptive correlational analysis, unless as we dig deeper into the data, we are able to think of a clearer identification strategy. If anyone here has thoughts about that, we would love to hear about that. We may think about some like policy changes, like changes in Title II funding, for example, like external shifts that we could then do a difference in differences design, for example.
Right. This next person says, I understand the focus on within state variation, but some of the variability here is also between states and could be meaningful. Would you say more about what you found when you went deeper into between state data?
Yeah, so we've focused on this within state variation because it's just such a large percentage of the variation we see. Again, 70 to 80% of the variation in spending is within states. And so we've spent our time trying to understand that because of how much it is. But yes, people love to ask about across states as well. And so I'm going to try to go forward in my slides to a map that shows you across states. Here we go. So this is sort of like the best way that I have right now to show you that. And you can see that there's clear differences across states. This is again adjusted for cost of living differences. So it's not that some states it's just more expensive and they pay people higher. And you can see that on the right-hand side, districts that are on the East Coast and a little bit on the West Coast, and especially the Pacific Northwest, are spending more per teacher. We have not done as much digging into predictors of this, but this is one where like union differences might be interesting to think about.
All right. Hopefully that answers that question. Moving on, is there a way to see per teacher spending compared with per pupil spending? If so, how does per teacher spending compare to the per pupil spending?
Yes, there would be a way to calculate that in our data. That's not something that we've done. We did typically PL spending is reported either as per teacher or this percent of the budget. So we've sort of gotten at per pupil with those two things, but not they are highly correlated. Like the number of teachers and the number of students basically move together. So I don't know that we would see something sort of different or interesting. It would be probably per pupil spending is higher in districts that spend more per teacher, but I'd have to think more about that.
There is one clarifying question in the chat, and I think it would help just like contextualize everything. Does this data include traditional public schools and charter schools, or just traditional public
Oh,
schools?
that is a great question. Yeah. So it includes both, but we don't have a cost of living adjustment available for charter schools. So in the final parts where we were looking at variation across districts with this cost of living adjustment, charter schools are not included there. But the overall trends in PL spending getting increasing, that was including charter schools.
Right. Aaron Hahn is asking, I'm wondering if you've explored paying to use a tool like GovSpend that aggregates district spending, and whether those tools might allow for more comprehensive analyses, even though it would be more expensive.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if we looked at GovSpend in particular. We definitely spend quite a bit of time looking at just what data was available, including some data like that could be purchased. And the data that could be purchased that we found just didn't have the consistency for PL specifically and the clarity of definition that would help us. And so we didn't feel like it, even though it had more detail, we didn't feel like the quality of the detail was good enough to warrant the cost, but also to actually be better than what we could get from the F-33, because it also wasn't totally national. But I'd have to look into that GovSpend in particular.
Ready. This next question, is there any data correlating PL spending per teacher with teacher responses / satisfaction rates of the PL that they receive?
There is so some of these earlier individual district studies, authors have looked at that, and there hasn't been a strong relationship. Like, we don't obviously see that districts that spend more have teachers that are more satisfied. I cannot do that with the data that I have, though.
All right, and I saw this in the chat earlier, so I'm going to ask Lynette's question next. If some PL is attached to teachers moving across the pay scale, then the ROI is salary related. How do you know that achievement is a top priority for teachers attending the PLs?
So the salary stuff is included in some of the prior studies of professional learning spending. It's not included in the data that we have here. And to the motivation question, we don't know why teachers might be motivated to engage in PL, but if students' learning is getting better, I would argue potentially it may or may not matter.
All right, let me go back at the top. And Arielle, feel free as you're looking, if any questions catch your eye specifically, let me know. This next person's asking, is there any data correlating PLs? Oh, we already answered that. I'm curious about any noticing / findings around teacher attitude toward PL post-pandemic and how that is impacting district decision-making around PL spending. It feels like we're in a very different space. Are PL participation rates steady, declined in comparison?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we hope that we can explore through the partnerships that we have at Annenberg with the Rhode Island districts and the Rhode Island State Department of Education. It's not something that we can get from this sort of like high level look at national trends in spending with just this revenue data, expenditure data, but I think is a really interesting question.
And Sandra is asking, is there a connection between PL spending in larger versus districts linked to educator / staff turnover in larger versus smaller districts?
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense if districts are having to spend more on PL because they have a lot of turnover. They have to sort of train teachers, or potentially there's another sort of reverse going on where districts that have a lot of turnover are districts that are just teachers need more PL or they have more inexperienced teachers. Unfortunately, we don't have any national data that we could connect to ours about educator or staff turnover, but something that we could potentially do with like individual state data.
And it looks like the next question is also asking about this the turnover rate, also like correlating with PL spending. So I'm going to move through those. This one is interesting. Curious to hear more on PL spending on curriculum-specific professional learning and what that PL looks like.
Yeah, we don't we don't know anything about that from this data. But something that would be interesting as we go into these state analyses.
Alrighty. And then similar questions here. Do you have data about what kinds of PL money is being spent on? So like workshops, coaching, on-demand offerings.
No, we don't have any of that information at this national level. We are, if we get these sort of teacher survey data that's nationally representative, we would be able to sort of say some general things about what teachers are experiencing, but we wouldn't be able to connect it to individual districts. So we couldn't say anything about like our districts that are spending more, providing more workshops or coaching.
A person is asking, although the historical trends indicate relatively flat spending rates, if we take the percent of the average district's budget, what is your best guess for how upcoming funding cliffs might impact how districts, how districts spend on PL?
Yeah, I'm just reading through that question to make sure I understand so I think this fiscal cliff is an important question. I mean, I showed you in one of the earlier slides that that we see a sort of bump with ESSER. And so my guess would be that it's probably going to go down, especially if this sort of like, if there is this pattern of districts kind of just like taking a percentage of their budget and giving it to PL, then if ESSER funding is going down, their budget is going down, and you'd expect PL spending to go down as well. But that is just like, we don't know that that's what districts are doing. That there's this one study that came out at a conference like 2 weeks ago that was talking about how school boards are talking about budgets that suggested that. But I don't know the extent to which that really extends across the whole country.
And this next question, Denise is asking, just for your opinion, do you have hypotheses for why larger, more urban districts spend more per teacher on PL?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, more urban districts are also tend to have more students that are English language learners and SPED. So I think there's this sort of question about, do students have more needs that teachers need more support with, or is it places that are harder to staff and have higher staff turnover, and so more professional development is required to sort of just like keep teachers there, or to train new teachers that come in. But I can't empirically look at any of those things.
Thanks, Denise, for your question. Do you have a sense for what funds are used to fund these PL spending? So general funds versus Title I versus Title II, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, when we first looked at the F-33, we were really hoping, since it is a survey of revenues and expenditures, that we would be able to do some of that like tracking of where does the revenue come from that then hence to the expenditure. But unfortunately, the way the revenues are divided up, we can't like match what of the revenue from specific sources is going to professional learning specifically. We did look at Title II. We tried to look at Title II patterns in particular because that is not solely for professional learning, but there's evidence that a lot of that revenue goes for professional learning. But there was just quite a lot of missing data that made us feel not great about drawing conclusions about the patterns that we saw.
From Joanna, is there info in your data set or analyses? Oh, I think this gets to the smaller rural districts question that you may have touched on earlier. Arielle, do you see that question?
Yeah, just give me a second to. Yeah, so we do have some data on like staff in the district. So I have the number of teachers to be able to calculate per teacher spending. And there was also this variable called coordinators, which sort of roughly matches to this PL spending. And we tried to look at that relationship, but it just wasn't a close enough the definitions were not close enough to feel good about that, like the people that are counted as these coordinators are the people that districts are spending for salaries and benefits. The looking at like just district size in terms of staff overall is a great idea. From what I remember, we only have that for like a very small number of years in our data set. So like 3 or 4 years. It just wasn't a thing that was asked for many of the years in our panel, but it might be interesting to do a sort of like individual year analysis.
All right, and I'm looking at our Ripple admin team here. We have time to address 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll follow up with the recording, the slide deck, and any other supporting materials that Arielle showed today. But if you could let us know what you thought of today's webinar so that we can improve our webinars in the future, that would be great. And just thank you all again for attending and your continued support for Ripple. All right, Arielle, we have a few questions here in the chat. I want to give you the chance to look over them and see if you can like group any of them. I think a lot of them are asking for like subject specific PL broken down, like reading versus math, hybrid model schools.
Yeah, I'm having trouble. My chat is just full of all the things that I didn't look at while I was presenting. Do you mean in the Q&A, Krista?
Yeah, sorry, in the Q&A.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, so I think a lot of these questions are getting to things that we're just not able to answer with our data, which is certainly a limitation of the study, and that some of the research that's out there from early 2000s and a little bit later has tried to address, but even that, it's very hard to get detailed data about district spending on professional learning because either it's at this national level where it's just super high level and we don't have those details, or if it's individual districts that researchers are going into, they're spending tons of time trying to pull these documents and talk to people to understand how they're interpreted. And so it's just very, very labor intensive to try to get these details. But I agree that they would be fascinating and useful to know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why Ripple exists, right? Because people are asking these types of questions, and we want to help answer them. So thank you for your questions. And then
Can I add one final thought, Chris?
yeah, absolutely.
So I think for us at Ripple, a key takeaway from this work is that it's not just about understanding what effective professional learning looks like, but also there's a lot of work to be done to understand how this money is spent and how the decisions are made. Because even if we did know exactly what effective professional learning looked like, it wouldn't have an impact on students or support equity unless we can help districts make better decisions about implementing that professional learning. And so I think this sort of opens up a new area that we want to dig into that hasn't been part of our core sort of let's understand effective features of professional learning, but is equally important. And district finance, I've discovered, is like a whole other world that that requires a lot of learning. So thank you for going on the journey with us as we've been trying to dive into this.
Yeah, and some folks from our network, Sarah's saying would love a part 2. So TBD, stay tuned. Make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter to stay abreast of Ripple's other studies. But thank you again for coming and attending and all your great questions. You'll hear from us soon.